Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for attending the Standing Against Racism White Work webinar. This is a conversation about anti-racism journey of white people. The Standing Against Racism is a signature campaign of the YWCA that takes place annually in April to raise awareness about the negative impact of institutional and structural racism in our communities and to build community among those who work for racial justice. My name is Idella Winfield. I'm the Church and Community Engagement Coordinator for the Christian Reformed Church Office of Race Relations. The Office of Race Relations focuses on 3 areas: learning to share the narrative by sharing stories of joy and pain, championing anti-racism leadership by developing leaders and building relationships, and valuing unity and diversity by educating at every level. This webinar is a collaboration between the Christian Reformed Church Office of Race Relations, the Office of Diversity, Antioch Podcast, and Calvin University. This will be about an hour-and-a-half long webinar, and unfortunately, there will be no Q&A at this time. This will also be recorded, and you'll receive a link to the webinar in the next day or so. And now I'll introduce the moderators for this webinar. Dr. Michelle Loyd-Paige is an Executive Associate to the President for Diversity and Inclusion and holds an appointment of Professor of Sociology at Calvin University. Reverend Reggie Smith serves as the Director of this Christian Reformed Church Office of Diversity. He served as the Director of the Office of Race Relations and Social Justice from 2016 to 2020, and was pastor of Roosevelt CRC in Grand Rapids, Michigan from 1994 to 2015. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Michelle.
Thank you, Idella. It is a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I'm excited about the conversation that's going to happen today. When we have the Antioch Podcast, there's a usual way that we open up, and we open up with a question that just kind of gives a check to see how are we doing or what's on our mind, something to warm us up a little bit. And we're going to do the same thing today. And so today, what we're going to do is we're going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. And as they introduce themselves, we'll ask them to state their name, perhaps how they are associated within this mix. So if you're a part of Calvin, if you're a part of the church, if you are, you are someone walking down the street and we said, hey, you, come here. Come to this show. But then we'd also like you to give us one word that would describe one word to describe your emotions about how you're feeling as a white person doing anti-racism work at this moment. So you got that? So your name, how you're associated with this project, as well as one word to describe your emotions or how you're feeling as a white person doing anti-racism work in this moment. And we're going to start with Stacia.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stacia Hoeksema, and I'm really excited to be here today. I teach in the social work department at Calvin University and have been a lifelong member of the Christian Reformed Church. So wearing a couple of different hats in this space today. I think the word that right now in this moment to describe how I'm feeling is the word weary. But then that is quickly followed up by some kind of a dismissal that says you shouldn't feel weary because you're white.
Thank you, Stacia. Libby?
Hi, my name is Libby Heisinga. I am also a lifelong member of the CRC. I work in the library at Kuiper College. I do anti-racism education with CORE, and I am a member of the Antioch Podcast.
Thank you.
And a word that I would describe where I'm at would be flamey.
Flamey?
Flamey, yeah.
All right, we're going to follow up with that in a minute. Eric, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, my name is Eric Niekamp. If I'm going to follow suit, I also am a lifelong member of the Christian Reformed Church in North America. I am on this team because I'm the producer of the Antioch Podcast. I do a little adjunct work at Kuiper and at Calvin University. And I just love doing this kind of thing. The word that I would say describes me today would be depleted.
Thank you. Joseph?
My name is Joe Kailama. Along with Stacia, I teach in the social work program at Calvin University and sometimes with Eric. And again, lifelong member in the Christian Reformed Church. I think the word that I've been circling back to this week is determined. Yeah, depleted, as Stacia says, but determined.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. And then Melissa?
Hi, everybody. Melissa Steck here. I am a freelance writer and consultant for the time being. I used to work for the Christian Reformed Church Office of Social Justice. To follow suit, I was born and raised in the Christian Reformed Church. I no longer attend Christian Reformed churches by choice. Happy to be here. And my word, or Michelle said that we could do a hyphenated combination of words. So my words are cautiously convicted. I'm feeling convicted in this moment, but also a degree of cautiousness because we white folks need to be mindful of how we do this work.
Oh, thank you. So we have weary, flamey, depleted, determined, cautiously convicted. When I think about these words, right, my mind is going all over the place. And that's like a whole nother conversation to say, oh yeah, let's get into this. But I wonder, as we're about to dive into this conversation, I wonder what concerns or what, I don't want to say baggage, but we can say baggage, but what are you bringing into the space as we begin to really unpack what white work means and what it looks like and how it's experienced as we do anti-racism work? And I'll throw it open to anyone to jump in. I won't go around and ask each person to speak into that, but is there something that's really on your mind as you're bringing in, something that you're thinking about? How does it feel to be broadcasting live to over 200 people now who are tuning in to listen about this topic of white work? What do you bring into this space?
I'll just name, and we talked about this as we were preparing for the event, about not wanting it to make it the focus of what we talk about. But I'll just name that I think we're carrying in the Floyd verdict to this conversation. And I'm sure that's on the mind of many of the people who are tuning in too. And the complicated ways in which people are reacting to that. You know, I'm a social worker, so we always say there is no one right or appropriate way to emotionally receive something like that. But I think we're all in different emotional spaces that probably have really been impacted by the week's current events. So just naming that, we're bringing that into the space. And the memory of George Floyd and the ongoing work for justice for George Floyd that we're all still working on.
Yeah, thank you, Joe.
I think that for a lot of white people, when we're entering into spaces where we're going to talk about racism, there's this whole series of kind of mental gymnastics, or at least that's what I experience. And so trying to prepare, how do I be vulnerable and be honest and yet not center myself, not be performative? You know, how will white people receive it? How will people of color receive it? There's just, you know, I think that I just kind of want to normalize that level of anxiety maybe, and also recognize that can lead sometimes to paralysis. So it takes a lot of mental energy I want to be seen as someone who, you know, a good white person, whatever that means or looks like. I don't want to offend people. So you come into this kind of space, we can't see anybody's faces, right? Like I have no idea how whoever's responding. So yeah, I just appreciate the opportunity to name that. And I think that that's a pretty common feeling coming into a space like a conversation like this.
Oh yeah, definitely.
I'll just, Stacia, and Stacia and I know each other pretty well. So I'll say, I was thinking about that as I was talking just now, right? Am I mentioning George Floyd as a white man fully because it does set the context, or is part of that performative on my part and wanting to jump in first and say it because it's virtue signaling, right? And I think there's some truth that probably that plays a role, right? So I think I appreciate you saying that, because even as I was talking, I was thinking about that, right? And it is such a huge part of trying to come alongside anti-racism work as a white person, is interrogating and over-interrogating our own motives for what we're doing. So thank you.
And if we add to that the desire to be seen as morally pure constantly in everything we do, but also with it the assumption that like my intentions are pure, that is so tied up with whiteness that it makes it really hard to see yourself clearly. And the difficulty of seeing yourself clearly just adds to that spiraling. So
yeah, for me, this has been a difficult week, not just with the Floyd verdict, but in my personal life, I've experienced some consequences from doing anti-racism work recently that I'm mentally debating, like, do I bring that into this space because I'm feeling wounded and hurt? Or do I leave that out because I want to look like a thoughtful, almost like emotionally disinterested kind of person that's objective? And if I'm authentic to who I am, my emotions actually color a tremendous amount of what I do. And so I'm trying to think through, like, how do I be authentic to who I am emotionally as someone that's dealing with some hurt around these issues, and at the same time provide something that's substantive to this conversation today.
Thank you all so much for bringing all of this into the room. And that's one of the things that we wanted to do with this live podcast webinar, is to make space, provide space to be our authentic selves and to name truth. And so I so much appreciate that you were able to do that. And so I will add one more, what are we bringing into the room? And then I'm going to turn it over to Reggie to throw out the next question. But one of the things I know that when we were designing and creating this webinar, the thought came, well, can I, as an African-American identifying woman, facilitate this conversation? Because it's white work. We came up with the idea. It's like, yes, we should have a conversation, because all the previous sessions that we have done with Stand Against Racism have featured BIPOC voices, which is really important to do. But someone one day had asked me the question, they were a white man saying, Michelle, someone told me that as a white man, I should not be trying to lead efforts in doing anti-racism work. So is it okay if I'm involved in the conversation? And that was like, yes, please be involved in this conversation. And so I said, okay, we need to amplify the voices of white individuals who are trying to do this work, and just to open the door, open a window into what is it like for white individuals trying to do this work. And it wasn't just the white man who had asked that question, and working with some white students at Calvin as well, feeling like, do I have the right to even say that I'm tired that I'm weary, that I'm hurting, because look at the hurt that you have. You know, they would say, look at the hurt that you have, Dr. Loyd-Paige. I don't even have the right to say that. It's like, no, it's a different kind of hurt, but we are hurting. So we are all entering into this space when we're having conversations about doing anti-racism work. We are all bringing something to the conversation. And I think it's important for us to remember that we are bringing our whole selves and our lives and everything that we're thinking. And we can have more honest conversations when we lay that out before people. So I would just want to say thank you so much for doing that. And so, Reggie, I'm going to turn it over to you now so you can proceed with the questioning.
Thank you, Michelle. Maybe, for our panel, kind of paint the picture of what led you into being a part of this work. And it seems like you approach it not so much from an intellectual standpoint, but from a personal and an emotional standpoint. There's a story behind this, and you're not just doing this just because it's just the day, but why do you stand against racism and also battle, as some of you already kind of pointed out, the supposed self-deception that can happen in wanting to do attention management and those kinds of things. So maybe lay out to some people who are listening for the first time, why do you stand against racism? And that can be anyone. Jump on that.
I know for me, it was hearing the stories of people who are not like me. I was a kid, and I joined a multi-ethnic church where, because I played by ear and was a musician who could pick up songs from a recording, I got placed on what was at the time the predominantly Black gospel worship team for the church. And our rehearsals would go in such a way that we would have devotions that would last about an hour. And the stories and prayer requests that I heard from my Black, who came to be friends on the team, I kind of felt like I was a fly on the wall. I was kind of this quiet, introverted kid. And I listened to all this stuff, and I'm like, there's a lot of things that I don't understand, and I'm seeing people that I'm coming to love who are hurting. And is there anything that I can do to respond to this in a way that's meaningful? And that started me on a journey. And then I met my wife, and my wife is a Chinese woman and who grew up in Geneva, Switzerland, and marrying her and hearing how she navigates the world in ways that are different than me, and her experiences are different than mine, and wanting to be a good partner to her. So, I mean, that's how I got started.
Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, I'll piggyback off of Eric's answer. I feel like what Eric's answer boils down to is love, right? I'm reading Bell Hooks' All About Love right now. Such amazing writing. And she talks about how without justice, there is no love. So where there are relationships where racism, where patriarchy, where the isms are in place, real relationship, real love cannot happen. And so it really comes down to, from a young age, seeing, for Eric, seeing from a young age that, like, oh, this is something that needs a barrier that needs to be overcome or worked through, worked out for us to really have a real relationship. And I've really, that's a big part for me. What has driven it is a desire to love people well and have authentic relationship, because racism requires us to be liars. It requires us to cover up what's true, and that doesn't make for real relationships. So, yeah.
Melissa, could you just perhaps provide an example of how does racism require you to be you to be a liar? What does that look like? Because I don't think most people think of themselves as, oh, I'm a liar. So what does that look like? Because I so agree with you that yes, that racism requires people to be liars, but what does that look like in everyday life? Or if one of the other panelists has an idea of what that might look like, feel free to jump in.
I'm a slow processor, so Joe, take it.
I have something.
I can give an example.
Okay, go ahead, Joe.
So, and this is my own story. So, racism requires me to lie about how I got my job.
Ooh.
Wow, you're really dialing it up right now.
Dial it up, brother. Dial it up.
So I work.
Here we go.
I work at Calvin University. I'm a white Dutch man who was born and baptized in the CRC. When I got a job here, I was hired by the faculty members who had taught me as an undergraduate student, by the president of the college at the time, who was a family friend. The provost was the mother of a guy I had childhood birthday parties with. And racism requires me to say that none of that had anything to do with me getting hired, right? That I was hired on the merits of my academic credentials. And those alone. And I think it's important, and this is what's often uncomfortable for white people, to say, look, that's not true. That's a lie, right? That's a lie. And for Christians, I think we should be able to do that. I point out, what do you have that you did not receive? Why do you boast as though you did not, right? This is the gospel. But yeah, so that's how I lie about this.
Wow. Whew. Yeah, well, so this is if we were just doing the podcast, this is when we just start humming. Yes. Here we
Hallelujah.
go.
Come
All
on,
right.
Jesus. Come on, Jesus.
Here we go. Holy Spirit.
Reggie's fanning himself.
Have your way, Holy Spirit. Yes.
Hot in here.
I had a conversation yesterday with a young white man who is actually a student of yours, Stacia. And we were talking about this, and we talked about 3 kinds of denial that go into whiteness. That there's a denial of privilege, that we lie to ourselves about our privilege, which kind of is what you were saying, Joe. And then like a denial of our own motivations for things. But really, if you're looking at it spiritually, it's a denial of our sin condition as white people who have inherited a colonial white legacy that was based on objectifying people and property. And just reducing everything to that, and participating in that, and saying, when we have racist outcomes from our actions, to deny that racism could be involved. It's like saying, I'm not sinful in that way. Everything but not that. And that basic denial that, like, no, I'm not sinful like that. It makes me want to say a bad word. And since we're live, I will not do that. But like, that's a whole special kind of sin. And it's hard to get close to somebody and talk about racism when the conversation has to be that they're not sinners.
Libby, you were going to jump in with something.
So Joe gave an example of like Melissa's statement about lying to yourself in terms of his job. And I'm thinking about like how I lie to myself as a white person in terms of like my relationship with other people. So I consider myself to be a naturally pretty empathetic person. Like I feel other people's feelings. And a lie that I have come to believe is that I can empathize with anybody across racial and cultural lines if I just try hard enough. And that has blinded me from the times in my life when I have hurt the people of color that I love, by thinking I understood what they were saying because I assume that I understand just because I tried. So I've lied to myself by inflating my sense of my ability to see the world clearly around me. And that's made me dangerous.
That's good, Libby.
Yeah, that's real good.
I'm gonna have to chew on that one for a while.
Lord have mercy.
So I'm thinking about also the lie about identity, and specifically when we think about our identity in Christ, and how the racialization that has happened has really warped, misshaped our identity. So as white people, internalized racial superiority, that somehow I've internalized this idea that I mean, similar to what Joe was saying, like I earned what I have, or that I'm in some way better or more right by being white. That really what that is a distortion, a lie about who God created me to be and how I am to be in relationship with other people. Right? So that he didn't create me to be like always get to be the helper or the fixer or the whatever, right? That it mars. It's a outgrowth of sin in the way that I am in relationship, that there's not this reciprocity, that there's not equity, justice, those kinds of things. And so Peter Cha in Chicago has this phrase called redeeming our racialized identities. And I think about that word a lot, right? What does it mean to submit, to bring my racialized identity to the cross and ask for the Lord to reform and transform that into how he intended for me to see myself and how he intended for me to be in relationship with others.
Yeah. Thank you. This is really rich. I think one other way that white people lie to themselves, maybe not intentionally, and I think all of this is perhaps not intentionally, is when a person of color says, that sounded racist, that was a microaggression, and then the white person says, no, you're taking it wrong, that's not what I meant. I think they lie to themselves that their words have unintended impact, because if you could accept the truth that your words had unintended impact, then you would say, I'm sorry, that's not what I meant, but I'm sorry, I see that has had impact, that was not my intention, let's think about how I can make this right. But when someone says, hey, that came across as racist, that was a microaggression, it's like, oh, nope. Reggie and Michelle are my friends, so there's no way that I could be racist. You're calling me racist, how dare you? That's another way how I think white people lie to themselves, perhaps not intentionally, but when they lie to themselves, when they say that their words carry unintentional impact at times.
Right. Yeah. It's almost as if you jump to reputation management.
Yes.
Because no white person wants to be called, I'm not a bad person.
No.
And it easily taps into, I must manage my reputation and it must be stellar.
Yeah.
From any attack or anything that's said like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's such a stumbling block for us because, I mean, it goes to show how much we've idolized being a good white person. Like we are so hung up on being a good white person that we will like sacrifice anything for it. But I think there's such freedom and liberation to say like, yeah, I am a racist. I'm a recovering racist. Like I was inherited this. I grew up in it. And there's freedom to just say like, you know what? You were right. You were right. I'm sorry that I did that. And let's figure out how I can.
Oh no.
We got stopped. No. So Melissa will jump back in, but Eric, you've been wanting to say something. So go ahead.
Yeah. That idea of like the good white person, John Buin has this really interesting podcast series called Seeing White. And he has a TED talk that he gave as well, where he talks about that he was been hung up for a long time.
Of like,
yeah, that's what happens on Zoom.
Yeah, that's what happens. Sometimes we freeze. That's okay. You know, this is live.
I'll finish up here. That his idea about being a good white person is what his TED talk is about. And for me as a Christian, looking at that idea for me, when I notice myself thinking I'm a good white person, I'm learning to ask the question afterwards, does this mean I have an unteachable spirit? And too often the answer is yes. Like I've got something to learn here. And that's hard. But I would much rather be a person in recovery than a person in denial.
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, that is so good.
Yes. Ooh, put that in the chat.
Yeah. Eric, could you just say again, who is that person who has the podcast Seeing White?
John Buin. He's a former NPR commentator that now I think he teaches broadcast journalism.
Okay. Thank you. Libby, you were going to jump in with something.
I don't have something, sorry.
Oh, okay. I saw that look. It's like, okay.
I was just trying to figure out how to spell Buin.
That works too. Go ahead, Joe.
Can I jump back to Reggie's question?
Oh yeah, please do.
Just because I really appreciated the way you framed it, right? Because certainly as a professor at a university and as a Christian, and as a social worker, my temptation is to say, these are the reasons that I'm interested in this, right? And to underplay the personal reasons. And I've learned that too is part of whiteness, right?
Yes.
To abstract, right? To make it intellectual, to make it as part of my profession, because who I am as a professional is what really matters. Like all this is tied up in whiteness. So I've become, only recently, Melissa was a student of mine back in the day, and I don't think I talked about why I cared about these things in the ways that I should have, right?
Yeah.
I think I talked about them as, you should care about this because you're a social worker, right? Or because you're a Christian. And for me, I cared about this because I started working at a Christian summer camp called Camp Tall Turf. And for the first time in my life, I was supervised and mentored by Black people. Black women, right?
Yes.
Very first time in my life. I grew up in Christian schools, never a Black teacher. I had one adjunct professor of color at Calvin University, right? So this experience was totally new for me and shaped my experience. And then even more so, a profound journey to understand the death of some children that I met there, right? So two in particular, and I just want to name them because I think I've also come to appreciate the power in naming these things.
Yes.
So, a young man named Blair Holt, who was shot from Chicago, who was shot in 2007 on a bus, got onto a bus and was shot randomly on the bus. Great kid. I had him, we sang together, we danced together, we canoed together, we did summer camp stuff together. And he was shot randomly getting onto a school bus. His parents were a police captain and a firefighter. This was not a gang-involved kid. And that, And how, right? How does this happen? This would have never happened to me. And then in 2012, a young man named Mahi Hayes, who was shot in an alley, half a mile from my house. What? You know, so for me, it's been a journey to say, you know, I grew up in the same city as this young man. I had known him since the time he was 8. You know, here he is, shot and killed. What happened? Why? How is this so different? And because I knew him, and because I knew the people around him, I knew his family. I had known them for more than a decade. I simply couldn't buy the lie that I was reading about why this happened. This wasn't just bad culture or gangster rap or something. And so it's been a long journey to try to understand what happened here.
Thank you, Joe. That's powerful. Yeah. Stacia, were you going to add something? You have that look.
Well, I was just kind of thinking back to Reggie's question as well, and thinking about, I think it's important to note that one of the reasons that I'm in this work, I think, is because of my very early upbringing. I was born in Rehoboth, New Mexico. And so for those of you who connected to the Christian Reformed Church, right, Rehoboth is a mission of the Christian Reformed Church for 150, maybe longer, years. And yeah, I think that, you know, that experience shaped me in really important ways. And I would say that some really significant seeds were planted around the importance of cross-cultural relationships and living, and seeing the world, like worldview kinds of things. And I'm so grateful for that experience and for the relationships that I still have connected to Rehoboth and Gallup.
Stacia, for people who might not know, what were those cross-cultural relationships in Rehoboth? Yeah.
So Rehoboth was is situated right outside of the Navajo reservation. And so most of the students, like in my class, were either Navajo or Zuni. And yeah, I was one of the few, we called ourselves Anglo students in that context, right?
Okay.
So is that what you were?
Yeah, that's what I was referring to. Yeah.
So, okay. So some really important seeds were planted in me about cross-culturalism and these multiculturalism, these kinds of things. But as I've grown, I've also had to come to terms and wrestle with the complexity of that story, right? So thinking about the complexity of the history of the Christian Reformed Church there, you know, boarding schools throughout United States and Canada, and needing to be willing to like re-look at the narrative I told myself about my own story. So I think it's like this place of holding beauty and brokenness together in tension, right? Because while some really beautiful seeds were planted, I think there were also some really damaging things that I internalized around paternalism and needing to be the helper, and some of those things I kind of mentioned earlier. So even though I was a minority in my like classroom, my dad was still the like superintendent, right? So as I've grown, trying to understand the different levels of like race and racism and systemic racism, and how does this play out, and what does this look like? So like Joe was saying, not just doing that at an intellectual level, but really trying to understand how does that connect with my story and my own history? And then what do I do with that, right? And how do I appreciate what's beautiful about it, and critique what's broken about it. So that's been a lot, I think, of my journey. Yeah,
that's good. That's good. I appreciate the holding intention, right? So when you're so young, you don't know anything else but this, and it seems right. And then you get an education, you have more conversations that are at a deeper level with people, and then your lens changes. And then in your case, going into social work, sociology, and all of that, it's like, oh, wait, this is another lens that I have to bring to this.
Right.
And it offered an opportunity to change your paradigm, to add a critique. I say it offers an opportunity, because not everyone who is presented with an opportunity to change their perspective takes the opportunity.
Yeah.
And so in taking that opportunity, right, to do this self-reflection and this critique through an anti-racist lens, that can often be costly. So the question that I have for you all is, what has standing against racism, being an anti-racist, cost you as a white person?
We're all calculating.
Yeah.
I can see your brains just going, right? Just going. Woo! That chip is going faster.
Yes. Yeah. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
We talked about this in preparing for this webinar. We had a pretty candid conversation about what can we say publicly and what can we not, because we have all encountered within institutions that we have worked with or for some of the consequences of truly standing up for anti-racism. I have lost relationships. I have lost people thinking I am a sane person. People thinking I am a reasonable person. They think I'm radical. I have lost what had become my favorite job of my career. So I open that to others.
Yeah. Thank you, Melissa. I so appreciate your candidness and the tension that is there. It's like, what
Amen.
Can we say? What can we not say? I mean, we experience that as the podcast team all the time. As the podcast team, we have the luxury of going back and say, oh, okay, let's edit this out. But this is live. And so having to think about what can I say and how vulnerable can I be? Do I want to be? Because this is something that is going to be out there for a while. So I just want to say thank you to you, Melissa, for sharing those truths and sharing it in the way that you did, to say, yeah, there's people who are thinking I'm too radical, I'm too crazy, I've lost my mind, I must be insane. This probably played a role in me losing my dream job. These are all real consequences. And I want to thank you so much for sharing that and sharing that. Libby, you were going to jump in with something.
Yeah, I want to add to Melissa's list about like people perceive me as angry now, which wasn't always true, no matter what tone of voice. But then there's this thing that goes on in me when I do experience consequences of aligning myself with the good of people of color. I experience consequences, and then I end up, one of the costs is this spiral that happens in my brain about like, I've experienced a real blow and loss of job opportunities and a loss of some of my personal wellness because I've engaged in conflicts. And yet the smallness of the cost that I've been hit with in comparison to the every single day costs of the people of color in my life. And then I get stuck in this cycle of like, these were real painful incidents I experienced. And my pain is allowed to matter, even if there's a bigger pain out there.
Yes.
And yet, how do I figure out how to tend to that pain and keep going?
Yes.
And so that's just an added, I think, lifelong part of this work. So
yes,
that's something
yes.
gained. But also, while I may have lost some of my optimism about the world, I may have lost some of my my biased love for the institutions that I've been a part of. I've also gained so much.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
That's a good reflection, right? Yeah, I've lost some of this, I've gained in it, but Libby, I so appreciate you even naming. It's like, okay, feeling the pain, knowing this cost me something, and then like, oh, but wait a minute, how does this compare? Do I even have the right to complain about this cost? Yes, I have a right to complain about this cost, but oh my goodness. So thank you for naming that, because that's a thing. That's a real thing.
But I want to say one more, that like, if you're a white person and you consistently ally yourself against racism, that you will also receive so much praise when you do even just the littlest thing. Like the fact that I'm even here today, like,
come on, preach.
I'm here because I'm a white woman who has consistently said I care about racism. And that's really all you have to do in order to be a panelist.
Low bar.
But you know, Joe, it is not a low bar. I mean, when we were starting to think about, okay, who are the white people that we know that would be willing to come on the show to speak about this? It wasn't like, you know, we were, you know, it's like, oh no, we got 50 people. How are we going to narrow it down to something that could fit to the usual thing? That was not the case. But we also, because we were really looking for people that not just said they were doing the work, but were doing the work and had the scars from doing the work.
That's right.
Because that mattered. That really mattered to us. Because we didn't want a naive voice saying, oh, I'm doing anti-racism work and this is so great. I was at this march and I did this march and I have this rainbow coalition of friends and it's all good. And look, my partner is a person of color and it's all good. We're doing this justice work together. More power to you if you're that person that's listening. But we wanted someone who could speak to both the cost and the reality of what this looks like when you get down to the nitty gritty. Yeah. Eric, you got something on your mind.
The thing that keeps running through my mind is Abraham on the mountain with Isaac, and God asks him to sacrifice his son. For most of my life, I have deluded myself that I was saving my influence for when it mattered. And so my rationale for not quite going as far as I thought I could was that I'm saving my chips for later. And then I started noticing that I'm never spending my chips because I wasn't going to put Isaac on the altar.
Come on.
And as soon as I was willing to say, I will tolerate my relationships with my family members being strained or maybe dissolving, when I put on the altar my relationship with my church could be strained or broken. My relationship with my employer may be strained or broken. When my financial solvency is on the line.
Come on.
And if I'm willing to put those things on the altar, I'm in a better spot to hear from God.
Come on.
But it hurts so bad.
Yeah.
And the thing is, like, it's incredibly clarifying to see things for what they are, that like my sin condition, my self-policing white body that tells me I kind of know the rules. You just don't, you can kind of do performative allyship as long as you don't cross certain lines. Like talk about racism like a thing in the past. You can do that. You can talk about the biblical foundations for being anti-racist as long as you don't apply it in a political way. You can talk about that it's like we should all believe X, Y, and Z, but don't tell people how to put the scripture into practice in a way that would affect lives or bodies or finances now. As long as we don't talk about application in the present, you're a safe white person to talk about anti-racism, and you get the t-shirt, right?
Oh, wow.
But
Eric.
Does it show up in your bank account? Does it show up in your relationships? Does it show up in your faith life? That's been my hard thing. Like I'm hurting right now because those three areas have been hit in really close succession in the last 3 months. And it makes me question, like you said, Melissa, like my sanity, my mental health is not in a great spot some nights. I'm struggling.
Yes.
And I feel like I'm trying to be the person that God wants me to be. And I'm doing it imperfectly and making lots of mistakes, but I feel like at least I'm spending my chips.
Yeah, that is so good. That is so good. And I'm noting a number of amens. Yes. Thank you for speaking that truth in the comments, Eric. Thank you so much. Joe, you're jumping in.
Yeah. So, amen to everything Eric's saying. And again, we were talking about this on Wednesday, but I made the comment that I think whiteness is self-policing, right?
Yes.
Whiteness polices itself. And we often think more about white privilege, what whiteness gives. We don't think as much, and I think that's because fewer people are pushing against the boundary about what whiteness takes away when you transgress on it, right? When you try to push against it, right? Willie Jennings, I draw on Willie Jennings a lot, Calvin grad, but Willie Jennings says whiteness really only starts to even emerge when you push on it, right?
Yes.
And that's when you see it for what it is. And I think to double down on what Eric was saying and to get just a little academic, because that's my thing, right? We love, and it's acceptable to talk about how to be anti-racist as Christians. What we hate doing is talking about how Christianity helped invent race.
Okay, this is another.
He didn't stop preaching and went to meddling now. You meddling.
And again, this is not me. I'm not taking credit for this idea, but Willie Jennings has, I think, very persuasively showed that whiteness as a construct emerges in the colonial process as Christians begin to imagine that they can relate to the world apart from the land, and that they can dominate and extract both the land and the people, right?
Yes.
So, I think Christians are like, okay, racism is this evil thing that happened in the world, and we're going to come along and bring our Christianity to it, right? And solve it. But until we can say Christianity at the root, right? At the root, we're not going to make progress on it. But when you start talking about that, that's particularly, as Libby says, when people say, oh, this person's lost their mind, right? And that costs you a lot, right? So just I'm on a professor watch list, right? From Turning Point USA. You can Google my name, dangerous professor. But I'm dangerous. Here's why I'm dangerous. I'm dangerous for having the audacity to point out that your good intentions don't matter, right? I wrote a piece about a swastika on a car, and the student who drew the swastika in the snow on the car and wrote white power said, I didn't intend to harm anybody. And I wrote a piece saying, it doesn't matter what you intended. You harmed people. And we as white people shouldn't be in the process of giving you a free pass. We can't forgive you on behalf of BIPOC people. That's all I said. I didn't think it was that radical, but it got me death threats and emails and the whole bit, right? So whiteness is self-policing. When you step out of line and even start to acknowledge some of these lies, the hammer comes down pretty hard.
Yeah.
I experienced a version of that where there was a small, in perspective now, between 6 months and a year, where when I started speaking out consistently enough, when I would say things in meetings, it would be met with silence, and no one would ask follow-up questions. And that devolved into marginalization, where all of a sudden I am excluded. I'm no longer invited to participate in new iterations of those committees. And the tasks that I am tasked with are slowly being removed, or you need to run everything that you say past a filter, or you can't pray about that in church. You need to write out everything you're going to pray in church. You can't sing a song and introduce it saying this relates to what just happened this week in the news. And those sorts of marginalizations, like it's like being on the watch list where you're literally being watched and silenced. And that happens in Christian organizations
it does.
And no one will ever talk about it, but the best way to get donations to keep flowing into a majority white Christian institution is to not challenge whiteness.
Come on.
And when you do that, you threaten offerings and donations, and people will say it's every other reason but that's the only one that threads all of them together in a way that makes sense.
That's true. If you're looking to raise some backlash, do something that will impact donors, and then you'll really start to find the walls.
Ooh. You can't serve Jesus in money.
No.
But can I ask my fellow panelists something? Have you noticed in yourself after you experience that pushback, I ask because I've seen it in me, a desire to like tell my friends of color about the times that people have pushed out or like pushed back against me, so that way I can get like some points. And then like I find how quickly my sin condition twists it, because I may have lost some of my group belonging in this white community, but I can use this as a means to climb the ladder of this other community and put myself in power over here. And I just find, oh boy, the mental emotional gymnastics.
Yeah. For our podcast listeners, there are lots of head shakes and an affirmation to what Libby has just said. It's like, oh yeah, let me. Yeah. And I'll just speak from the other side. Yeah. There sometimes I get emails from people saying, oh, this happened when I did this. And it's like, okay. I'm so sorry this happened. Praying for you.
And it came back down.
And then I have to resist from saying, oh, and you want to hear what happened to me today? You want to see my email list? Okay, here.
You want to see my scar?
Yeah, you want to see my scar? Okay.
Well, you no, go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just going to chime in to say, like, I think that's part of, because here's something that I think Stacia started alluding to earlier, that like, there's a bit of, and this is not to be like wham white tears, but like this is to just name that there is a loneliness in doing this work, because what I've learned is that, like, okay, because of that dynamics that y'all just talked about, like I know better at this point than to go to my friends of color and be like, oh, this is so hard, can you believe it?
That was so good.
That was good. That was good.
but the challenges, but the feelings and the challenges that we have are real.
Oh yeah.
And there's not a lot of other white folks to go to about it. So I especially this past summer when things were really blowing up. I remember feeling so fatigued and so lonely, and just craving a space like this, really.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need more spaces like this.
Yeah.
And I'd like to, go ahead, Joe.
I was just going to say that's before the gaslighting, right? That says, and Libby alluded to this too, but you're feeling lonely and then you spiral into, maybe I am being unreasonable, or maybe I have been too angry, right? And you just get in this weird headspace where you feel like you're doing the right thing. You don't want to go around looking for pats on the back because you're doing it. And then you start questioning whether it was the right thing or am I doing it the right way? Because all around you, there's no affirmation for exactly what's going on. So it just leaves you very vulnerable to that gaslighting. And I think that's why it doesn't happen so much. Like, I totally get that. I've had periods where I'm like, you know what, maybe I'm not trying to see both sides enough, right? Maybe I do need to reach out to more, conservative, some of my conservative white family members who are saying like, you've gone off the deep end, man. So you do, and you go through this and you try, but it's so hard to try to maintain a sense of clarity about what you're doing.
You're not being loving enough, Joe. That's how it's expressed to me. You're not, you love people of color so much, but you just don't love white people enough. You need to be more like Christ.
Can I add something here? I don't know that we're supposed to be getting into like what helps yet, but while we're talking about this, I just want to put in a plug for caucusing.
Yeah.
And that is something that's been really essential for me in doing this white work, is being able to go to spaces where I can process, what does it mean to be white in this space? What do I do with all this stuff that Melissa's talked about, that Joe's talked about, like the whirlwind of thoughts? How do I do, because there's all kinds of stuff that's happening inside of me that's legit and real, and those are real feelings, and those are real things that are going on. And how do I deal with that and process that and not have that be an additional burden for my friends of color to have to carry? But I've internalized things, that I've been socialized in such a way that it's I'm going to steal one of Eric's words. It's recovery work, right? It's sanctification work.
Yes.
And and then I think it's a spiritual discipline to ask God to uncover this mess, right? Like, sin is just always crouching. Libby, when you're talking about how, you got this cost here, and then all of a sudden in a minute it turns, like this sin is crouching at my door, seeing who it may devour, right? At any moment. Yeah. And for me, caucusing has just been really, really valuable space to deal with some of that in a real trusting environment.
Stacia, would you give a quick definition of caucusing?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So caucusing in this space, a lot of times people think about caucusing like political parties. In anti-racism work, it's often used as this idea that it's sort of like when you have marriage counseling, where you have a couple and they're having some issues, tensions, things aren't going well. There's some work you can do together, but there's also maybe like, oh, this spouse needs to do some of their own work. This spouse needs to do some of their own work before they can come back together and do that in harmony. And so caucusing is actually where you have a white group and generally a people of color group that can take on some different iterations depending on the context. And what we're there for is not to solve what the other group needs to do to fix racism, right? So when I'm talking with white people, I'm there to talk about my whiteness and where is my whiteness showing up in this? I have my own work to do. People of color have their own work to do, right? About how racism has shaped them. But if you do that in contexts where there's trust and accountability, then you have your conversation, you come back together and you say, hey, this is what we talked about. This is what we talked about, and so forth. So if people are looking for a resource, I think some people have been putting that in the chat. CORE, Congregations Organizing for Racial Reconciliation. I'm also a trainer with that. Libby mentioned that in her intro. We do caucusing regularly. I think there's one coming up this Sunday. But I just, the website is CORE now, CORR now. If that's something you're interested in being involved in. And they're virtual, so if you're not here in Grand Rapids right now, you can participate.
So you guys are guides for white people who are trying to find out how to approach this, maybe some for the first time. What things could you help them to get started on this journey of anti-racism work?
I'll say that when I start this with students, you know, as an educator, right? So I'm talking to a lot of 18, 19-year-olds who are coming into the work, as I did often at a place like Calvin, with no frame of reference, right? They've come up through exclusively, predominantly white institutions. Now, I approach this conversation differently if they're interested in doing the work or if they're resistant to the work. And I think that's there's huge differences. But let me just talk about those who are interested in doing the work, because I'm going to assume that if someone watches this, they're interested in doing the work. And to those students, I always say, resist the temptation to try to solve something. Dial back, because that impulse to fix it is born from a white identity where you have often had the agency to be able to fix it. Right?
Oh, that is so good.
Part of being white is the agency to be presented with a problem and fix a problem, right?
That is
so we're presented with a new problem, we care about it a lot, and then we're like, all right, well, let's solve that, right? And that again, this is my own journey, right? This is why I became a social work major. Worked at the camp, problem. What do? I'm going to be a social worker. I'm going to solve that problem. Now, I've been working on this, but I've learned to say, step back,
Joe.
slow down, listen, understand, listen, try to understand. So that's where I say to start the journey. And that feels really bad for white people because they want to say, I can grasp this quickly and I can fix it quickly. And neither of those things is true.
And you said also those who resist.
I'm going to let somebody else take that.
So another metaphor that's been playing in my mind in terms of my white identity development, you know, I would say my first few years of saying yes, I'm in it and doing the work and feeling like I've made so much progress. And then if you're if you're on a hike and you get to the first peak on a mountain, that doesn't mean you've arrived. It instead means you have a vantage point to see how much you have left to go. And so if you're feeling yeah, I've really got it. I've got this white allyship thing down. That might mean that you're approaching your first false peak.
Yes.
So if you're feeling really confident about where you are, that might mean that you actually have a long way to go.
Woo!
So that's an opportunity for you to start doing some looking to see what can I see from this vantage point about where I'm being called to grow more.
Yes, and amen. Yes, if you're feeling confident, you are feeling confident.
You in trouble?
You are not there yet.
You ain't there yet.
Are not there yet.
Can I say something about that though? Because I actually think that even just in and of itself is a challenge to whiteness. right? Like for me to say and to in my spirit be like, it's okay for me not to be confident about this or competent in right? And to recognize that my inadequacy is okay.
Yes.
And actually essential.
Yes.
It's just a really uncomfortable space to live in and be in, but I think it's really, really important. I'm trying to learn how to live there more authentically.
Yeah. Go ahead, Eric.
So I'm a dialectical behavior therapist, and in dialectical behavior therapy, there's this central idea that is the balance of acceptance and change. And in dealing with whiteness and racism, it's sort of like you need to accept yourself as that being a white person is completely okay. You are a person made in the image of God. You were raised in a culture that lend you lots of tools to believe certain things about the world, some of which are true, some of which you're finding out are not true.
Right.
Okay. And you have to accept all that. Don't be in denial about it. Just accept it. The other part is change, that for the world to be a better place, there are some fundamental changes that need to take place, and they are going to go deep. And it's not just out there, it's in here, in your heart. And as the dialectic is balancing those two things. They're both equally true at all times. And you might feel like you're like flipping between them, but it's sort of like those old-fashioned teeter-totters where like you're trying to keep both ends from just crashing into the ground by standing in the middle and doing this back and forth work. And it for me as a white man, this has been that thing that like sometimes I feel like I'm on one end of the teeter-totter a little bit more, but learning how to do that dance is really critical to keep trying to find new, deeper layers inside of myself and inside of the institutions I'm a part of that I can do work in.
Thank you. As we're getting within sight of when we're wrapping up our conversation, I feel like we need to do a part 2 because this has been really good conversation. But what is something that has helped you on your journey? A resource, a reading, a podcast, something that has helped you, or something that you recommend to other people? I know we've been putting resources in the chat, but if someone is saying, hey, this is really good, I'm feeling this kind of, I'm feeling something stirring within me, I want to do something, what can I do in the next week, or what can I do in the next 30 days? And they came to you, what would you say? Hey, what can you read this, or do this? What recommendations would you offer someone who wants to dive a little bit deeper into this work in the next week, in the next 30 days? What would you recommend? Melissa, you're shaking your head. Yes, I'm going to start with you.
It's funny because like I literally have this book within reach. So let me just.
Yes.
Okay, so I've read a lot of books related to anti-racism, related to explaining the systemic aspects, the interpersonal aspects, but the book that changed me because it forced me to ask questions of myself and not to just apply these things about like, oh, my racist so-and-so loved one in my circle, but it forced me to ask questions of me, is Me and White Supremacy by Layla F. Saad. If someone could put that in the chat as well, because it's really succinct in the chapters, but then there's reflection prompts. There are questions for you to reflect on and to journal.
She is freezing up a little bit. So we're going
to yourself.
Okay, she's back.
And
You're back.
going back to the the cohort, or not the cohort.
Oh no.
She's
frozen again.
She's frozen again. So we're going to.
You're back. She's back now. She's back again.
Oh no.
So Melissa,
you're back. You're back.
Froze after you had recommended the book and what it had meant to you. So, and someone did put it in the chat. So we do have that information.
Okay.
Someone else, what is a resource or something that you would recommend to someone, either something that helped you or just something that you would recommend to someone who is wanting to do a deeper dive into this work?
So one thing I would recommend is finding another white person who's on the journey that you are committed to talking to about what goes on in you in situations relating to race and anti-racism and speaking out. But I would want to make sure that you're being choosy about the person you pick. So caucusing, that Stacia mentioned, and if you go to cordnow.org, you'll see that there's a sign up for a caucus once a month. You could do that. Or if that's not right for you and you want to find somebody, make sure that you pick somebody who's willing to encourage you to try harder.
Yes. Yes.
Sometimes, if I go to somebody and say, I had this bad experience about race, or like I felt really insecure, and people will just be like, oh no, you're great, keep going. Look for somebody that's gonna make sure to challenge you, or maybe create some sort of mutual agreement that we will challenge one another. Having a place to go to talk about what's going on inside of yourself is a really important step to making wise decisions.
Thank you.
So I already recommended Willie Jennings, so I get a free pass on that one. Read everything Willie Jennings wrote, although that's a little hefty.
Yes.
In terms of a recommendation that I give to a lot of people who are starting out right now, I think Isabel Wilkerson's new book, Cast, very good.
Yes.
I've been running some book groups with it on campus, some intergroup dialogue book groups around it. And I think it does really excellent work helping people from the United States see what we have here as not just an issue with racism, but a racialized caste system.
Yes.
And particularly it'll help you with the institutional dimensions. So really love Melissa's suggestion on an interpersonal, inward looking. That's a more institutional book, but Cast by Isabel Wilkerson is really good.
Yeah, thank you.
And then real quickly, if you are local to Grand Rapids or tied to the CRC, I'm going to give you a political thing. And I will also say that I think sometimes Christians imagine that we can engage racism non-politically without any sort of political ramifications. And I think that is a lie. So we're going to have to get used to that. So my recommendation is that on Tuesday, the Grand Rapids City Commission is going to be voting on funding potentially for something called Cure Violence, which I'm very passionate about. A community-based, evidence-based alternative to policing that seeks to reduce, through harm reduction, gun death in our city.
Yes.
I said this is why I got into it. The death of these young men, it's still one of my main animating things. I would love to see Grand Rapids pursue some alternatives to policing that might help us, potentially alongside policing. I don't know where, we don't want to get into that whole discussion, but reduce gun death. We want less people to be killed with guns. And this is an evidence-based way to do that. So the City Commission meeting Tuesday in Grand Rapids, if that's where you're at.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you. Appreciate that. Someone had mentioned that, last year when we did this webinar, that there was we made a recommendation to do a media fast from whiteness, and how that had really helped the person, and just really because it challenged them to think about how does whiteness show up in their media feeds, whether it's their social media feeds, their personal ones, or the ones that they follow, taking a fast from that and intentionally seeking out voices and people of color, and how they're speaking into some of the issues that they care about, but what does it look like from a different perspective? So that's something you could also do in the next 30 days. It's just to change your sources of information. Where are you getting your information? And just to look at something different.
And I want to add, if you are working on your media diet, make sure to include images, not information, not just about like bad things that are happening to people of color, but look for opportunities to experience the joyful day-to-day experiences of people of color.
Yes.
Because as people have said, this work isn't just about what you know, it's about love. And for me, I find watching, you know, Black celebration and Latina joy and Asian family and the beauty of people's moments helps grow my love.
Yes.
And that's what we're looking for.
Amen.
Yes.
Amen.
Yeah. I thank you for that, Libby. Yes. So don't just look at, yes, we're not just people of sorrow.
Right.
We're not just people who are victims, but and even in the midst of all that is going on, finding joy, because if we don't find joy, we die. So we finding joy, finding those things that sustain us. In this age of virtual worship, and if you are a person of faith, go find a worship service with people that look nothing like you.
Amen. Amen.
Nothing like you, to find joy. And if you're really brave, tune in to some of those services that are not only joyful in their worship, but are speaking about social justice issues as well, so that they're coming through with a whole lot of truth about engaging in this culture. So if you're really brave and if you really want to know what some of those churches are like, shoot me an email and I'm happy to share some of my favorites with you. But that's important too, because that will help you to realize that as people of faith, it's not, as people of faith, we celebrate what Jesus has done at the cross. But as people who are living in 2021, we need to be about the business of making that work of the cross a reality today. So yeah, that's important so that we understand the churches, as Christians, as Christ followers, we are not separated. Our faith does not excuse us from doing this very good work to make the gospel a reality in our everyday lives. So yeah, Eric and Stacia.
You go first, Stacia.
Well, I submit this humbly because I think it's an area I need to work on significantly. But I think as white people, we just need to shut up and listen. And I struggle with that, right? And so how do I really listen? And maybe that's related to some of the things we're talking about, like our media diet and so forth, but also like in committee meetings and in relationships and how do I find ways to listen deeply and not in a way where I'm thinking about analyzing and discounting and discrediting what a person of color might be saying. And also thinking about ways, how do I amplify voices of people of color, of BIPOC folks. That's something I've been challenging myself with. So listening to, but also amplifying. So what does that look like? I mean, I think there's lots of ways that can look, but I'm challenged by that.
I've got a couple resources. One, if you are still trying to figure out what are your action steps, this is a really good book by Jamar Tisby, How to Fight Racism, where he will talk you through 3 families of action steps that you can take. And it would, if that needs to be your discernment process, I need to even learn about what I could do, that he's a really good guide. one other is the Racial Healing Handbook.
Yes.
It's a workbook by Annalise A. Singh, and it is a workbook that either mixed race groups of people, people of color only, or white people only can use to. It has lots of questions and activities that you can do. So if you're in your friend group or a caucus group, this is a curriculum that will help walk you through layers of understanding when you can't lead yourself there. She's a PhD person who's been doing this for years. So it's a great book. And the third resource, this will be a huge surprise. Listen to the Antioch Podcast.
Oh yeah, that'll thing.
The Antioch Podcast, here's what makes us different. We're a podcast of 6 Christians, 2 Black Christians, 2 white Christians, and 2 Christians who are middle voice folks. And every episode, the collection of us that is able to gather, we talk about an issue, either something that's in the news, something in scripture, just different things. And you'll get to hear a variety of people who take their faith and anti-racism really seriously and hear that kind of a dialogue. So most of us don't have friendship groups that are that diverse. So this gives you a chance to kind of, really push your thinking by listening. You literally are listening to the voices of people who are not like you. And I guarantee there'll be somebody on there that doesn't represent you, whose perspectives and ideas can challenge you to grow in your faith and anti-racism journey.
Yes. We are now just within a couple of minutes before we are wrapping up the conversation. I think, Stacia, you had a resource that you wanted to name? Nope. Okay. I just want to say thank you so much. Someone is for this time. This has been a rich
Amen.
conversation. We were trying to imagine what this was going to be like. This is beyond what I had hoped it would be, but then it was all so much of what I had hoped that it would be. And I'm saying I mean we that hope that this would be. I think what we have demonstrated is that there is a need for white people to be in conversation about their own journey, so that the loneliness doesn't have to be borne by itself. And one of the things that, again, reminded me of how much, one of the things that reminded me of how white people can be lonely in doing this work. I've, in those moments where people have reached out to me, it's like, hey, something has happened. Hey, Michelle, just want to check in with you, see if everything is okay. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm getting all this, but I'm wondering if Eric or Libby or Stacia or Joe or Melissa are getting these same kinds of emails or text message to say, hey, just checking in to see how you're doing. No, they're not people of color, but they are also deeply impacted by these types of things that go on. And so ways just to acknowledge their pain, ways to acknowledge their courage, ways to acknowledge that this is costly work. So my siblings, just want you all to know this is important work. This
Amen.
Was an important conversation.
Amen.
We've taken a step. Let us commit that this will not be our last conversation. And you know what? You don't have to have the Antioch Podcast to facilitate that conversation. You can have that conversation with those who are around you. And if there is no one around you, try to find someone who is there. As Libby has said, try to find someone who can walk this journey with you to have those honest conversations. But until then, I'm Michelle Loyd-Paige. This has been the Antioch Podcast. And Idella, if you wanted to come back in to sign off or anything from the CRC CNA. And you are muted.
Can't hear you.
Sorry, I was trying to do 2 things at one time. Thank you all for joining us, and prayerfully that we can start talking about a part 2 So stay tuned for more conversations on anti-racism. So thank you guys, all the panelists, and for a wonderful job, and hope to see you guys soon. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.